there's not much in this world that means more to me than the music of Final Fantasy. When I first played Final Fantasy VIII at the age of 10, I was enamored by everything about it, but for some reason, one aspect that captured me more than anything else was its soundtrack. At the time, music wasn't something I had particularly noticed before, but this soundtrack resonated with me. It evoked emotions in me like nothing else had, and ignited in me a passion for music that still burns to this day. What I didn't realize at age 10 was that I wasn't alone in this experience. By the time Final Fantasy VIII came out, the series was already famous for its pioneering scores, and composer Nobuo Uematsu was considered a legend in the realm of video game music, one of only a few key composers widely credited with elevating the perception of this burgeoning new form of music. Taking equal dashes of inspiration from classical music, as well as modern pop and prog rock, he has this profound ability to lace melodies with complex human emotion, revealing through the music that which is otherwise left unspoken. His soundtracks invaded our homes and touched the hearts of thousands across the world, inspiring countless people to take up music for themselves. YouTube is full of inventive cover versions of his tracks, and on OC Remix, Final Fantasy makes up 4 of the top 10 most remixed titles. His themes are taught in schools, they've featured in the Olympics, and have had multiple international concert tours dedicated to them, helping to reinvigorate modern interest in the symphony orchestra all across the world. Nobuo Uematsu's legacy is immense, and the success of Final Fantasy and its scores have helped to craft a blueprint for the construction of video game soundtracks, not only in their sound and the quality of their individual themes, but also in their implementation. Melodies are used to represent locations, characters, relationships, ideas, and these musical themes are developed alongside of their subject matter, unfolding across the course of the story. Musical motifs are reintroduced, rebuilt, and rearranged to highlight new story beats, elicit new emotions, and help to tell the tale on screen through the music. This technique has a name. It's called Leitmotif, and it's not exactly a new thing. It was famous for its use in film scores before video games even existed, and dates back at least to 19th century operas. But video games are a relatively new thing, and offer a completely unique experience to any other type of media that preceded it. So in adopting this old musical storytelling technique, video games must adapt it in new and inventive ways to fit within the modern medium. And arguably, no other video game franchise has used Leitmotif as deeply or as extensively as Final Fantasy. So hi, and welcome to Warriors of Leitmotif, a study of the use of theme and leitmotif throughout the Final Fantasy soundtracks. Join me, Matthew Dyerson, as we go game by game through the main series and pick apart its melodies, what they mean, and how they are developed throughout each title. On top of that, we will take a look at the timeless themes that have evolved over the decades to become some of the most iconic video game tracks of all time. In this first episode, it's a bumper 3-in-1, as we explore the original trilogy of titles and ask the question, what does Leitmotif look like within the modern context of video games? Alright, let's mosey. First of all, it's important that we are all on the same page as to what a leitmotif is, because it can be a complicated and often misused term. Leitmotifs are recurring, short musical phrases that are associated with something present in an accompanying story. Now, that is by no means a perfect definition. It leaves a lot unexplained and was conceived before video games even existed. So let's explore it by breaking it down into its 3 core parts, starting with that last one, association with story elements. In the late 80s and early 90s, video game stories were rather rudimentary. Defeat the bad guy, save the princess, be a bad enough dude. The NES, or perhaps more accurately Famicom Final Fantasy titles, certainly built deep, wonderful worlds primed for evil forces to take over and heroes to save. But there wasn't a whole lot in terms of overarching narrative or character development. The characters you played as were mostly just nameless avatars, known collectively as the Warriors of Light, or individually as their classes. It wasn't until Final Fantasy IV that priority was given to telling a story, and characters received their own in-game default names. Or musical themes, for that matter, but we'll save that for the next episode. The closest that we do get to a character theme on the NES titles is the Chocobo theme, a 7-second looping melody introduced in FF2 to represent these cute little guys. They returned in Final Fantasy III, along with an expanded theme, introducing a second section. With this extension of the melody, it breaks up the monotony of the short loop, but it also adds an appropriate bounce in the music, which you might expect when riding a chocobo. The Chocobo theme could be seen as an early precursor to how character themes will be implemented in the series later on. So while there weren't really any strong characters or story elements in the original trilogy that could have musical motifs attached to them, there was something new that films or operas didn't have to worry about: gameplay. Most video game tracks are written for a very specific context and inherently represent some aspect of the gameplay. There's music for when you're in a town, or when you're in a battle, or a menu. It could be said that the victory fanfare represents the narrative idea of victory, but it's never really used outside of its intended gameplay context. Functionally, it's just a joyful tune that plays after a battle, while your party gains experience and levels up. The thing about video games though is that they simultaneously build two separate types of story. There's the written scenario with the scenes of dialogue and the plotted events, and then there's the emergent narrative, the story that emerges out of gameplay. So while a random encounter has little to no bearing on the overarching plot, it can still be considered a part of the story that the player experienced, just as if it was a scene in a film. This certainly has implications when tying musical themes into story, and it's something I aim to explore in this series. There is, however, one musical theme that begins to approach a wider narrative theme within the games. Each of the 3 NES titles open with the same dreamlike piece called the Prelude. Hearing this theme every time you boot up the game almost conditions you to associate the melody with starting an adventure. And ever since, the Prelude has been used in future Final Fantasy games and even their advertising material to evoke that feeling of new beginnings. Even the second game in the series already plays into this idea, using the track in sanctuary buildings where you revive fallen party members, giving them new life. With saying all this though, it doesn't necessarily make any of this leitmotif per se. A piece of music displaying this single criterion of representing a subject can probably be more accurately described as a theme, which is why we need to return to our definition. Moving backwards through it, we get to short musical phrase. This is the motif part of leitmotif, and to me, kind of implies that it has to be a unique melodic line. It doesn't need to be an entirely complicated or complete theme by any means, just a passage that is distinct enough to be recognizable and easily connected by the audience. It could be as simple as the bass line in the battle music. Although each of the NES games have their own unique battle theme, they all share a common bass line in their intros. I'm not saying it's a leitmotif, just that it fits our definition so far as a small musical pattern that is used to represent something multiple times. In this case, conflict. The key to me is that word recognizable. What purpose does a leitmotif serve if the reference is so subtle that it no longer evokes the original idea at all? At that point, it essentially becomes an Easter egg. The problem is that this can be rather subjective. What's noticed by one more astute listener may not be so obvious to another, perhaps more casual player. I don't know if recognizability is something that makes it any more or less of a leitmotif, but again, it's something I hope to explore in this series. Another question it raises is how short is short? John Williams famously did it in just 2 notes, but it could and has been done in even less, which is more of a musical syllable than it is a phrase. On the complete other end, how long can short be? The chocobo motif might be the entire 7-second loop, and the prelude motif could be considered at various lengths, from just 4 notes to 16, 32, even its entire loop if you consider the chord progression. At what point does a piece go from being a leitmotif to a variation of a theme, and what's the difference? Which brings us to the final aspect of our definition: recurring. When a musical theme reoccurs in a game, it can take one of 2 forms. Most often, it will just be a repeat of the exact same music cue, whether that's because it's a specific track that plays whenever you're in a particular area, or the looping of that track after you hang around for a bit. It doesn't matter how many times you enter a store in the first game, wherever it is in the world and whatever you buy, the shop theme will always be no different to the one that played the time before. A musical theme on its own may only project a single image of its subject, and a lot of the time this is perfectly okay. However multifaceted that single image may be, it doesn't account for developments that may occur throughout the story. The personality of a weapons shop or a small town can probably be contained within a single theme, even if you do return to that place multiple times throughout your journey. But for something more complex like main characters, a single version of their theme might not be enough to fully capture them, as they are placed into different situations and reveal more of themselves over the course of the story. So sometimes, new versions of that same musical idea are created with slight variations made to it. It might be a transformation in the melody to highlight a transformation in the character, or an entire theme played by different instruments to elicit a new feeling, or a small melodic fragment inserted into an entirely new piece to link the 2 ideas. Anything, as long as it is still recognizable as that same core melodic idea. This sharing of thematic material between tracks happens surprisingly little in the NES titles, considering how much of a role it goes on to play in future Final Fantasy soundtracks. There is of course the famous themes that return game after game, but within the individual scores, there's almost no actual use of proper leitmotif to represent the narrative themes. Almost. As I previously mentioned, Final Fantasy II features the prelude whenever you boot up the game, as well as in the sanctuary buildings. However, that same melody is also borrowed in another track. At one point, the party must ascend a tower to obtain the Ultima spell, which is sealed at its top with the 4 elemental crystals. In the final bars of the tower's area theme, you can actually hear the prelude motif being used. This could be seen as representing the crystals, which are located in the final area of the dungeon. This connection of the prelude as a crystal motif is reinforced quite heavily by the next game in the series. As per usual, Final Fantasy III opens to the floaty arpeggios of the prelude. Once you start a new game and enter your 4 characters' names, they fall into the crystal cave and you immediately hear it again, with that same basic motif arpeggiating up and down in the intro. And it's then incorporated into the main melody as well. As you might expect from this foreshadowing, the party eventually stumbles across a crystal that imbues the 4 Warriors of Light with their power, at which point you hear another ethereal variation of the crystal motif that just repeats that ascending section. This very simple example is typically how we'll expect to see leitmotif used and built upon in future soundtracks. However, If we return to our definition, it doesn't actually mention transformation of the thematic material as an aspect. This could imply that the shop theme example from earlier technically classifies as leitmotif. After all, it reoccurs every time you enter a shop, it's short, looping every 25 seconds, and it represents something in the player's emergent story, going shopping. Its length may be its disqualifying factor, typically a motif is only a bar or two long, but ultimately, none of this really matters. It's pointless trying to fit video game music into an antiquated definition of leitmotif, because in many ways, it doesn't and can't fit. Video games are a unique modern medium that present novel challenges when scoring them. They can only ever take what's suitable, use it in new and inventive ways, and continue to develop the idea of leitmotif from the film scores and operas that came before. After all, evolution is at the very heart of leitmotif itself. The exact definition of leitmotif may vary, whether due to differences in people's understanding of music or the time period they were born in and the type of media they consume, but the purpose will always stay the same: to fuse the musical score with the narrative of the piece that it's accompanying. Arguably, the most important and powerful function of leitmotif is its ability to morph and develop musical ideas alongside of developments that occur in the story. But it's not the only way of achieving that fusion. Throughout this series, I'm going to be talking about leitmotif, theme, and variation, but I won't necessarily always distinguish between them, because in my mind, they ultimately all achieve the same goal of furthering the story through the reuse of thematic material. In the original trilogy of Final Fantasy titles on the NES, there wasn't all that much of this. They did introduce all of the recurrent melodies that would give the franchise its musical identity, which in turn laid the groundwork for how themes would be implemented within the individual soundtracks. But for the most part, music served a highly functional role, closely tied to its gameplay component. The little use of leitmotif that is present was to be further built upon in the era of the Super Nintendo, starting with Final Fantasy IV, which will be the sole focus of Episode 2 of Warriors of Leitmotif. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to Sideways for his invaluable help with the script. We had a long conversation about leitmotif and its use in video games, which we actually recorded and you are able to listen to right here. Warriors of Leitmotif is a very ambitious and potentially a little bit crazy dream project of mine. If you'd like to see it happen all the way through, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, like these wonderful people already do.